Welcome back. We will today finish up with utilitarianism, talk about John Stuart Mill, which is somewhat different from Bentham. Bentham and Comte, you may say, reached the highest level of belief in this purely mathematical, scientific approach to ethics, and from now on we'll be kind of moving back from away from it, because it does seem like this is not very satisfactory for many reasons. So John Stuart Mill is a good example, and his biography also tells us a lot about why he thought the way he thought. So who was John Stuart Mill? He was a son of James Mill, and James Mill was one of the closest associates of Bentham. Bentham, James Mill, and several other people were known as radicals at the time, and John Stuart Mill was really growing up in this environment. They visited Bentham all the time. They were all friends. They knew each other. To add to this, his father, James Mill, wanted him to become a genius, you may say. He was giving him a really intense education, amazing by any standard. So beginning when John was 3 years old, his father subjected him to rigorous educational experiment to show how the proper education could turn the blank mind of a child into a learned, rational machine. He began teaching John Greek arithmetic at the age of 3, believe it or not. At the age of 3, he was already learning Greek language. At the age of 6.5, he wrote History of Rome, complete with footnotes. At 11, he was taught Latin, geometry, and algebra, learned philosophy and logic when he was 12. That is truly amazing. But that led to a fairly heavy burnout eventually, because he, you may say, didn't have a normal childhood and turned into this learning machine a little too early. When he was 20, his lack of normal childhood and fatherly affection caught up with him. He suffered a mental crisis and severe depression. This purely scientific, hard learning type of approach to life turned out to be a little bit too much. So all his intellectual and political goals seemed to lead to inner emptiness. He was on the verge of suicide, actually. And this is when he had kind of a change in his approach and his understanding of the world. Here's a good quote from one of his works. "The habit of analysis has a tendency to wear away the feelings. I was thus, as I said to myself, left stranded at the commencement of my voyage with a well-equipped ship and rudder, but no sail." So it's great to have all this fantastic knowledge, but you have to have more than that to lead a full life, which is what he realized. And so he still wanted to be faithful to Bentham and his father. He still continued with utilitarianism, but he made very significant changes to it. Although it was unsettling, but he recovered. He recovered from this breakdown several months later with a new outlook on life, discovered that happiness cannot be the direct goal in life, but is natural accompaniment for pursuing other worthy goals. Right? So you cannot just set yourself a goal of happiness and just pursue it directly. That is not how it really works. In fact, a lot of his writing is on how you develop yourself. He was using, it was quite popular at the time, German word Bildung. I don't know if you guys ever heard of it, Bildung. It's basically, it's translated, can be translated education, but it's not really education. It's more like building yourself. And that was actually at this time when they decided that the university education shouldn't be just a preparation for a job, as many people think today, but should be preparation for your whole life. It should give you things which will make you more rounded, full person, rather than just give you a skill to learn a living. Skill to learn a living, that's a professional school. But education at the university is meant to fulfill your life and give you new goals and new understanding of reality, which is why so many subjects here are required, even though they don't have direct connection to what people intend is their profession in the end of the day. So this whole idea was growing up in the 19th century. Many new universities were created. University College London, when Bentham's body is displayed, was actually a product of this too. It was started in the 19th century by Bentham, among other people, and developed into this kind of a Bildung type of institution. So second thing he realized is what his intellectual development lacked was cultivation of feeling and appreciation of the arts. One thing I personally really love about Mill, he was definitely a critical thinker, and he was trying to not just continue with this very progressive idea, but he was very sensitive to the arguments against it, which were coming from people of more conservative point of view. And he was trying to integrate it. He was trying to integrate their point of view with the more progressive point of view of people who wanted to reform society like his father and Bentham. So he refined utilitarianism in quite a few ways. If you guys read his work, you would immediately see it. Even though it is built on Bentham's ideas, but it is a lot more refined. It is a lot more complex and interesting. So happiness, the experience of pleasure and absence of pain, is still the only thing desirable in itself. And this is his famous quote, which goes towards the end of the utilitarianism, which many people have problem with. He said, "The only proof capable of being given that the object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that the sound is audible is that people hear it. And so of the other sources of our experience. In like manner, apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it." What is he trying to say here? Well, first of all, of course, that we shouldn't tell people what they should desire. If people desire it, then it is desirable. He was very much pro-freedom, pro-liberty, and that's why one of his most famous works is called On Liberty. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. But that is all connected to his idea of utilitarianism, rather than with Bentham. When you look at Bentham, it seems to him that the calculation of this total happiness is the only thing he cares about. And if in that case you should give up your goals to increase the happiness of the great number of other people, then you should give up your goals. And that is, of course, not the way Mill is looking at it. So two of the biggest differences with Bentham. One of them is what is the criteria for evaluating pleasure. He introduced the idea of quality, not just quantity of happiness. So it's not just that we add up happiness in some sort of units, like 10 units of happiness, 20 units of happiness. There is happiness and there is happiness. There is pleasure and there is pleasure. Like Epicurus, remember who we talked about last time, Mill believed that the intellectual pleasures are superior to the pleasures of the body. Hence to him the higher and lower pleasures. Higher and lower pleasures. Not all pleasures are equal. Here's another good quote. Of the two pleasures, if there be one which all or almost all who have experienced of both have a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. So if people, just as an example, had pleasure of reading the book and then pleasure of eating tasty meal, and these people will tell you, And these people will tell you that they got better kind of pleasure from the book than from the meal, then that is a higher type of pleasure. And this is another quote to kind of explain it a little bit better. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So what is he trying to say here? As many people simply do not experience this higher level of pleasures, so they have the position of these grapes are sour. And that is, of course, something you hear a lot, right? People say, oh, all this art. What's in art? I don't know. I don't understand it. What's with opera music? They're crazy people just singing incoherently. So much better these simple pleasures of tasty meal, some beer, and a football game. But that is because they really never experienced the pleasures of those other things. Whereas people who experience them have better, in a better position to compare both. So again, if we start measuring that's the problem with saying if you desire it, it is desirable. Are you desiring it because you desire it? Are you desiring it because society or some people brainwashed you into desiring it? And if they did, maybe your desire is misplaced. Mill is onto it, but he seemed to be still on kind of a precipice here with like this more traditional ways of thinking. So here's what he said on Bentham in that sense. Man is never recognized by him as being capable of pursuing spiritual perfection as the end, of desiring for its own sake the conformity of his own character to his standard of excellence, without hope of good or fear or evil from any other source than from his own inward consciousness. So he puts more emphasis on our self-development and self-control and individualism. Now another difference with Bentham, whether self-interest was the basis for all of our actions. Do we always act to pursue our own interest, like this ethical, egoistic hedonism? Remember, the egoistic hedonism is different from psychological hedonism in that hedonism itself just says that we pursue pleasure, but the egoistic one says that we pursue our own pleasure. Now, if we do something for other people and that gives us pleasure, that's not exactly the same thing as if we do something for ourselves and it gives us pleasure. And in that sense, you can be perfectly well less selfish, but more happy by being less selfish. Mill emphasizes much more strongly that we naturally have social feelings for humanity and desire for unity with our fellow creatures. In other words, we may be happier when we are indeed surrounded by happy people. And that's a big question. Like, let's say you can create yourself in any way you want, have all the money you want, all the power you want, but you are surrounded by the miserable people. Like, if not everybody, then almost everybody around you is absolutely miserable. Would you be truly happy? Or would you be happier if you don't have all the money and power, but other people around you are happy? Now, Mill is saying, since we're social animals and we are connected to other people, second situation is actually better for us. If we become too selfish and only pursue our own pleasure, even this pleasure is spoiled by the fact that other people may be miserable, and we can't help but feel something about that unless we are psychopaths or something. The happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent of one agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as disinterested and benevolent spectator. So in other words, you have to take happiness of others into consideration all the time and try to take this kind of a neutral stand and understand it from this neutral position rather than pursue your own happiness and give it preference. Now, the importance of liberty, like I said, was very, very big for him. In fact, Mill is considered one of the, I would say, fathers of this liberalism in a traditional sense, right? So he realized that the possibility of the tyranny of the majority could be worse than any monarch. You can live in a democracy and suppose that the majority is deciding things which completely take away all pleasure from your life. For whatever reason. That is the view of the majority. But you yourself are miserable. What good is it to you then? As an individual, you still have to have some protections. Just because everybody, majority of, not everybody, but majority of people think something, doesn't mean that minority should be always disregarded. In some situations, you need to take all opinions into consideration, not just the majority. So that's the problem with democracy, and he saw it very well. This is traditionally more conservative argument, but he was very sensitive to this argument. Some of his friends were conservatives, and he definitely understood this point. And that's the subject of On Liberty, which he wrote in 1859. It is still considered a masterpiece, very important book. So in that book, he defends liberty. Liberty, unlike freedom, is more of a freedom from outside oppression, right? Freedom itself is more internal, something which you yourself have or do not have. But liberty is freedom from oppression from the outside, in particular government, other people, and so on. So things like censorship, intolerance, imposed conformity are some of the greatest dangers that a society can face. For unlike a foreign invader, they arise in the midst of society and masquerade as defenders of the social good. Within the sphere of the personal lives, we should have the fullest amount of freedom to do as we wish, provided that we do no harm to others. That, of course, is always important. You can have all the freedom you want, but don't encroach on freedom of other people. Whether that can be achieved and how it can be achieved is a big question. Well, there's a large but interesting quote. He says that the sole end for which mankind warranted individually or collectively in interfering with the liberty of actions of any other number is self-protection. Right? So you only can interfere with other people's liberty for self-protection. For example, if other people are stealing, well, you have a right to restrict their freedom because they're stealing from you among other people, right? So that actually encroaches on you in this case, so they cannot do whatever they want in this case. But that's the only reason. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of the civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. So we cannot tell people, don't do it because it's bad for you. Well, we can tell them, but we cannot force them, right? If they want to harm themselves, they have a right to harm themselves. We cannot force them not to do it. So his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others, to do so would be wise or even right. These are good reasons for remonstrating with him, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him, or visiting him with any evil in case if he does otherwise. So that's the point he is trying to make. Of course, if somebody does something which affects you, you have a right to stop him. But if somebody does something which hurts them, you don't have a right to stop them. You can only give them advice, talk to them, and that's the most you can do. Example would be drug use, right? Alcohol abuse. Well, in this country, we also tried the prohibition. Just telling people, don't drink alcohol, it's illegal. What happened? Did people stop drinking alcohol? No. They were drinking it just like before. It was just more expensive, and some people made more money on it by selling it illegally, the bootleggers. So then eventually we gave up. We were like, okay, you can drink now. And people drink. Some of them drink to excess. Some of them drink responsibly. Some don't drink at all. But they decided for themselves. Even though you may make a case that it's not good for people to drink because many of them don't know how to stop themselves and slide into this dangerous territory. But Mill would say even with drugs, people still should be able to make those choices. If they want to use even hard drugs like heroin, they should be able to make these choices. Do not restrict them, unless there are some exceptions. So, but let's take a look. So, freedom of thought and expression. Society is harmed by the suppression of free speech, regardless of whether the ideas in question are true or false. That is a very important point he is making. You cannot shut somebody up just because what they are saying is false. He thought it's very important to give people freedom of speech. The case of Galileo showed that the majority are often wrong and the nonconformist is often right. Galileo said that the Earth revolves around the sun, just like Copernicus. Remember, Copernicus was the first one. Galileo actually published a book, and they forced him to abdicate from that because church didn't agree with it. But majority of people at the time also thought that that was not the case. Majority was sure that the sun revolves around the Earth, which makes sense, right? I mean, look at it. The Earth is very stable, and the sun goes around. Don't you see what's going on? I mean, yeah, like science must be wrong. Surely anybody who have eyes can see that the sun revolves around the Earth. But then turned out that Galileo was actually right. And eventually we even flew into outer space ourselves, at least some of us, and saw it with our own eyes, that this is how it is happening. So from this perspective, standing on the ground, that doesn't make sense. But then once you go out there and see it from a different perspective, you actually understand that it makes sense. That really is how it is. And we discovered that because of gravity, we're not falling off the Earth, even though people were puzzled about that too. Like that was one of the arguments. If the Earth is indeed circling around the sun, why don't we just fly off the Earth? How can we stand on it? Well, it has gravity. So that's one thing. Then even if the idea is false, we still should let it be heard. To expose it to the light of free discussion so its errors may be revealed and so the outlines of the true opinion can be seen more clearly. You should not suppress an idea because you think it is false. Well, first of all, that immediately assumes some sort of higher authority. Who is to decide which ideas are false? Obviously, we all think certain ideas are true, certain are false, but then we discover we may be wrong, right? So if somebody disagrees with you, don't shut them up. Give them an opportunity to express themselves, disagree with them, bring your own arguments, and maybe they'll convince you, maybe not, maybe you will convince them, maybe not. But this is, he thought, a fundamental right we all have, and this is good for the society overall. For one thing, if somebody holds the opinion you think is false and you're not talking about it, does it mean they will change it? No, they'll just be hiding it. But if they express it openly, you have a chance to talk to them and explain why they are wrong. And they may disagree with you, but at the very least, they will see that there is certainly some other point of view which they may not otherwise understand. Even if their ideas are false, dissenters from the ideological status quo make a contribution, for they prevent intellectual stagnation and force us to re-examine the grounds for the prevailing convictions. So that's another important point. Truth does need to be challenged. If you defend your position, you understand your position better. If you have something which you hold to be true and it is never challenged, it starts to stagnate. It basically, you yourself no longer feel it in the same way. So that is the point he is trying to make. It's actually, to me, also resonates very well, because I think I told you guys, I actually grew up in the Soviet Union under the communist system, which was very oppressive in that sense. Like, they really had rules what you are allowed to say and think. And that was strictly enforced. There was censorship. Anything published had to go through the censor. At the time, there was no internet, so it was very easy to do it. There were already Xerox copy machines, but they all were under the strict control of the Communist Party. And you could not make any copies without specific authorization, because they didn't want people to just spread around the words which were not allowed. And they thought it was a great idea, but that actually was one of the reasons why Soviet Union collapsed. It collapsed because people like me, younger people who are growing up, saw that this is not the truth, that we got problems with it, and they were simply shutting us up, not letting us to express ourselves. And it looked like there was a pretense that this is indeed an agreement, that everybody is in agreement about it, this is the truth. But in reality, more and more people inwardly understood that this is false, that this is no longer valid, that there are many questions remain. Why is this done in that way, and so on. And as a result, the tension kept on growing, and eventually the whole thing collapsed. So restrictions of the freedom of speech, of course, sometimes are necessary, but only when it threatens to cause immediate harm. Here's an example he gives: an opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor. That was very popular at the time, by the way, in England. Corn dealers are starvers of the poor, ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to excited mob assembled before the house of corn dealers. Right? So the big difference. You can publish it in the papers, but if there is already a mob with pitchforks standing outside the house, and you start exciting them even more by telling them, oh yeah, those corn dealers, let's just get rid of them all, then you are inciting basically a riot. And that is still the standard here, because even with First Amendment, there are certain things you cannot say simply because they will incite violence. And if you are aware of that, and if you know that you are saying it at the time when people are excited and somebody can get hurt, then you are responsible for these consequences. So this, of course, is a restriction. It's one thing to have it in a peaceful discussion somewhere. It's a different thing to tell it to people who are already in excited state of mind. Outward life, freedom of choice and action. So individuals are best judges of their own interest, but are not always the best judges of interests of others. We all know our inner world, right? We have an idea what we enjoy, what we don't enjoy. If other people, even if they're very good judges of that, even if they are maybe more experienced in life, but they are different people. They have different experiences. It's not always applicable. So for them to tell you what to do is wrong, or at least to force you. They can tell you, but not force you. Even when individuals choose what harms them, it is best to let them choose, because it is their own choice. Do you guys agree with that? No? Well, again, there could be some restrictions, right? One restriction he himself recognized: children. I mean, clearly, if somebody is 5-year-old or 10-year-old even, their ideas about what is good for them are not there yet. You may want to interfere and help them out because they will thank you later. That is, of course, clearly a situation where there has to be some sort of outside control. We cannot just let 5-year-old children decide to do whatever they want. But when it comes to adults, let's say people who are over 21, if they want to do something, yeah.
Is it okay for me to go out to town square and just start screaming for no reason?
No, but you see, the interesting part here, where does it begin to interfere with the other people? Because many people make this argument. It's almost never the case that your choices are your personal choices. At the very least, you have like family, right, who cares about you. And if you do something really stupid, that will make them miserable. They will actually affect them. Similarly, maybe with other people. So is there truly such a situation when you are completely in control of yourself? There was a big debate during the pandemic about the masks, right, and the vaccination. And that's a great example when people would say, well, but this is my choice, my body, my choice. Okay, wait a minute. But this is a communicable disease. You are spreading it to other people. People are dying. Is that really your choice? I mean, if you are not vaccinated, getting sick, going out, having a party with no mask, and spread it to 5 other people, one of them dies. Well, that's no longer really your choice, is it? You're now interfering with other people's health and well-being. Of course, there is an argument being made, oh, but this is all useless and they don't really prevent disease. And then you go into like statistics and scientific arguments, and some people just don't understand them either. Plenty of people don't understand statistics at all. When I teach it in 102, you may have seen when I explain how the sampling works and probabilities, many students don't understand it. They think, well, if you take a sample of 10%, you only have 10% probability that this sample is representative. Oh no, this is not how it works at all. It actually depends on the randomness, and there's a lot of other factors here. So try to explain to these people these scientific issues. And some people, of course, just lose their patience, right? And then they say, okay, this is the law. You have to vaccinate, okay? No more discussion. We cannot explain all of this to you. You have to go back to school or something. And then 10 years later, you'll understand it. But then you interfere with their freedom in a sense. You force them to do something they don't want to do. And then this is always a complicated situation. Where is this clear line? There is no clear line. When does your freedom end and other people's freedom begin? Well, Mill still thought that in many cases we should let people decide.
Someone's right.
Is it the same thing though? If you are stalking somebody and they feel like,
you're not physically, you know.
well, for one thing, you are doing something. You are stalking them.
Oh yeah.
It's not like if your comparison with somebody on the street is not stalking you. He is sitting there, you're passing by, maybe you don't like what you see, but you keep on going. In this case, they actually are kind of entering your life in a way. Like, I guess you assume that they're stalking from a distance and you never notice them, but then is that always the case? Usually that's not the case. If somebody starts stalking somebody, eventually it becomes noticeable. And then it really may start to interfere with a feeling of personal space and even your feeling of safety. Again, if we look at this homeless person, imagine if he actually does encamp in your backyard or something. Now it's kind of a little bit different than passing him on the street, right? Or at least like right next to your house. There are obviously some boundaries which can be crossed in both cases. And that's probably what Mill would say. Like if all he does is like lives in a ghetto somewhere and takes drugs, and you only occasionally may have a chance to see him, then he's not really encroaching on anything. But when it becomes more visible, yeah, but then the question also is, does he do it deliberately? What's the what is the amount of choice in this? Perhaps everybody makes a choice for the first time when people take drugs. But after a while, is this still a choice? If somebody has been on drugs for several years, I don't think it's a choice for them. At this point, there's no choice. So yeah, that's the thing with like making a choice, which then leads to consequences, which no longer is even choices. Yeah. We'll come back to this entire thing when we start in the end talking about social justice and economic justice, which of course is closely connected. But staying with Mill, that is still, it's a very interesting position and relevant today because there's a lot of this debate happening today. But let's continue, let's see what else he's saying. So one good quote here: "The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign." So personal autonomy is extremely important to him. Note the difference with Nietzsche. What would Nietzsche say about that? It's actually interesting because they lived almost around the same time. Nietzsche is a little bit younger, or quite a bit younger, but they overlap. What would Nietzsche say about this personal autonomy? And funny enough, if you remember Nietzsche, his position was hard determinism. We don't have any personal autonomy, he would say. It's an illusion. So from that point of view, it's a moot point. Nobody has any authority. We think we do, but in reality, life is completely determined. Mill does not believe that, even though he believes in science, but he still thinks that there is some degree of freedom. Big question is, what is this freedom? How can you describe it without going into some sort of theology, spiritual issues explained by religion? But nonetheless, he kind of presumes it, and that becomes a thing too. People presume the freedom of choice without going into the scientific issues of how is it possible, does it confirm with physics, and so on. So believing into the freedom of choice, he is saying that we should give people freedom of choice. The only exceptions, like I already mentioned, one of them is minors, who for the most part are not likely to have enough experience or maturity to make sound decisions. And otherwise, as long as the action does not harm others, it should be allowed. This also raises actually interesting question about, are some mature people can be like children too? For example, if there is a mental disease. If somebody is mentally ill, should we take away their autonomy? But when you put it this way, there's immediately a dangerous ground about what does constitute mental illness? How does it, because psychologists have some standards, but it still is not very straightforward. And again, going back to my time in the Soviet Union when I was growing up, plenty of people were deliberately put into mental institutions because at that point, unlike in Stalin's time, they would just shoot them or send them to Gulag. In my time, it was not like that. They would say, oh, you know, you're insane. How can a sane person ever question communism? If you question communism, you must be mentally ill. So we'll just put, for your own good, we'll put you in an institution, and they will treat you, and you will then get better. And then they will start, you know, injecting you with all sorts of crazy stuff, which eventually will turn you into a vegetable. There's a dangerous line, clearly, because, I mean, who's defining this? If somebody has a proper license and medical degree, are they allowed to decide that you are mentally ill, and then based on that, authorities can place you in an institution? Is that actually something we want to see happening? But at the same time, there are clearly people who are insane. And if they are not restricted, they can do damage to others too. That is a difficult question. So yeah, he did not think there was such thing as natural right. When we talk about natural right philosophy, which will be after the spring break, we will see that actually still many philosophers disagree with it. And that is an important point. Why? Because in the end of the day, if you remove this kind of natural right, natural ethical ground, you do seem to make people more cynical about the whole thing. And then it becomes difficult to argue why should we even pursue other people's happiness and all this stuff, other than just like some sort of rational, cold rational approach. But rationality can just as easily support the fact that you should support just yourself. So Mill does not ground his principles on any notion of intrinsic natural human rights. So-called natural right is an abstract notion that is not empirical and hence cannot be verified. Instead, he argues that individuals should be free to perform any actions that do not harm others, because this principle will maximize the general well-being of the community, and that's it. In good empiricist fashion, the principle is justified in terms of the observable consequences. But interestingly enough, closer to the end of his life, he was moving further to the left. In fact, many people consider him also a transitional figure to what liberalism eventually will become. And he was even accused of being a socialist. Speaking of himself and his wife, I didn't talk about his wife. He actually really loved his wife. Rather, for many years, she was not his wife. She was somebody else's wife, but they fell in love. And at the time, it was kind of difficult to get a divorce, so they were not divorcing. She was not divorcing. Eventually, her husband died, and they got married. And shortly after that, she herself died. That was quite devastating for him. And she was very left, actually. And she was a big influence on him, and people argue also how much did she move him to the left. Either way, towards the end of his life, he moved further to the left. So in the end, he was saying our ideal of ultimate improvement went far beyond democracy and would class us decidedly under the general designation of socialists. But that raises the question here, what exactly is socialism? Because we hear all the time people say, okay, if you have free medical care, that's socialism. And then what do they immediately talk about? What is the example of socialism when people say that? When somebody says, we don't want socialism in this country, what examples do they give? Yeah. Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea. But is this the only country which have free medical care? No, definitely not. Canada has free medical care. The United Kingdom, Britain has free medical care. So in that sense, is this socialism? Does Britain have socialism? Well, clearly not, right? Because it's not all or nothing. The idea that it's like either socialism or capitalism is a wrong idea. I don't know, maybe we already talked about it, but it definitely is more of a scale where on one end you can have countries like United States, which are a lot more capitalist, but still not a pure capitalism. In fact, if you take economics class, one of the first things they'll tell you, there's no pure capitalism. No country in the world has pure capitalism because there's always some government intervention. The government does at least some redistribution, even in this country. Don't they have like the food stamps and other stuff? Well, they do. It's impossible not to have it. To find pure capitalism, I don't know, you would have to go like several hundred years back to the times when they would take 10-year-old children and make them work 15 hours a day in a factory until they die at the age of 15. Now, maybe that was pure capitalism, but even that had some pushback. But of course, today we don't have pure capitalism. However, we have more capitalism in this country compared to, on the other end of the spectrum, countries like North Korea or Cuba. But even here, you can argue whether that really is socialism. What's the definition of socialism? What did Marx call socialism? You guys know?
I'm not really sure
So
though.
Marx defined it, not in these terms, but he defined it in terms of ownership of means of production. Right? Means of production, factories, stuff like that. That should belong to the workers, then it's socialism. If it belongs to the private owners, then it's not socialism. So that's the way Marx was defining it. There are different ways to define it, really. It's kind of a slippery concept. If you actually look at it, even like Google it, you'll see there's a number of different definitions. But in reality, Marx at least defined it as when workers are in charge of the means of production, and the argument can be made that it never happened in the history of the world. None of these countries have it. Countries like Cuba or Soviet Union did not have workers in charge of factories and the means of production. Who was in charge of factories and means of production in the Soviet Union? The government. Who was the government? The bureaucrats, the party functionaries. Are they the workers? No, they never even been in a factory. How are they the workers? This is the people who go through the steps of career in the party apparatus, and maybe at some point when they were very young, they may have worked at the factory for a little while, but as soon as they become party functionaries, they no longer workers. And therefore, the workers are not in charge of the means of production. The state is in charge of the means of production, and then that becomes state capitalism, because the state can exploit people just as well as the capitalist can. The state itself becomes the exploiter. So we'll talk about Marx in the end, but according to Marx, Cuba, North Korea, Soviet Union were not communist states. They actually were state capitalists. The state there was the exploiter. So several other of his contribution, in case if you take Philosophy 102, when we talk about induction, a lot of it is actually based on his work on logic, inductive logic. That whole part was developed by Mill. Quite a lot of contribution there. Even logic textbooks today have so much inherited from Mill. The problems which other people have found with Mill's account, it's more appealing overall. It does seem like Bentham is a little more sterile, whereas Mill takes more into consideration. However, how does he decide that one pleasure is better than another? We already talked about that, right? This quality of pleasure, it seems like indeed a very vague concept too. Intuitively, there may be something to it, but hard to say. What is total pleasure? That's another thing. Another problem is sometimes there is a tension between utilitarian goals of creating the greatest amount of happiness and creating happiness for the greatest number, right? The greatest number may not necessarily be the same thing as the greatest amount of happiness. Suppose we can create more pleasure by torturing some people to please others. Should we do it? It seems like there's something fundamentally wrong with it. How well does Mill really account for that is a little bit questionable. His views on race and women is also interesting. He was very progressive about women. He wrote this Subjugation of Women work, which basically called for women to have right to vote. At the time, it was very progressive. Very few people would agree with it, but he, based again on his experience with law of his life, did think that this is the way to go. Women should have equal rights with men. He was advocate for improvement relations between the sexes, women's suffrage. Both Mill and Bentham were progressive members of this movement, but Mill defended British imperialism. That's actually another thing which kind of is interesting. He thought that some nations, some races, are like children themselves, and then the more developed races have a right of also, for a while, treating them like children. Now, today, of course, it sounds very wrong. But at the time, especially given that India was a colony of Great Britain and he worked for West India Company. That actually was his profession. He was a functionary there. That did seem to kind of make sense, but many people now call him, because of this, tolerant imperialist. He was very tolerant, but still had this imperialistic kind of thing. So application of the principle, that is the most complex part. We mentioned it last time. How do you calculate? It seems nice in theory, right? But calculating it becomes a difficult part. What is the common unit of measurement? How do you decide this is 10 units of happiness, this is 5 units? What is a unit of happiness? Can you really put a number to it? I cannot. I can't say like the pleasure I get from a tasty meal compared to the pleasure I get from reading a book. Would it be like 5 units, 10 units? I have no idea. What is a unit? What is a unit of happiness? That seems to be very, very difficult to think about that. Personal integrity, that's another tension there. Utilitarianism does not privilege our happiness over that of others. And there seems to be something counterintuitive about that. Can we really think about it in this way as human beings? Can we count our own happiness equal to some perfect stranger? Maybe if it's your child or your brother, but if it's a complete stranger, should we? Well, maybe we should, but can we? Is it even possible for a human being to do that? Ends and means. Utilitarianism holds that the consequences of our actions determine whether the means to them are justified. The ends, the goals, the consequences, the purpose versus the means, which is ways of going about it. And that, again, seems like a little bit of a problematic concept. So if a vigilante kills serial rapist, is that a good thing? Utilitarianism based on the consequences and based on the act itself. So act utilitarianism talks about just whatever this specific act may produce. But then there is a bigger consequences we can think of in terms of what if everybody start doing it, right? And there is a difference. You may judge every action just based on the action itself. But you may also think about it in terms of application for other cases. What does it do to other people? If we as a society start thinking that vigilantism is okay, yeah, in some cases, maybe indeed a person who takes law into their own hands would be right. But would it always be? And would we not send the wrong message? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in ideal world. But actually there are consequences even if you are right, because from the legal point of view, vigilantism is never allowed. And that's probably why. Okay, we're kind of running out of time. There are several other things we didn't talk about, but I advise you to read the chapter because it's all in the chapter. We discussed everything else. For next week, just before you go, for next week, there is a reading from Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. It's fairly large, but I definitely advise you to read it. I uploaded one specifically because it's a better translation than the one they link on Cengage. Otherwise, yeah, I guess that's all the time we have. So see you guys on Monday.